The clouds rolled in like dark ships sailing across an angry sea. Sarah Mitchell stood at the fence line of the Double R Ranch, watching the horizon turn the color of old bruises. She'd grown up in these Colorado mountains, and every instinct in her body screamed that this storm would be different. The wind carried a smell she recognized from childhood, that metallic tang that came before nature showed its teeth. Jack Reynolds didn't know her yet. She was just the veterinarian from town who'd come out twice to check on his pregnant heifers. He was new money, a tech executive from Denver who'd bought the ranch 6 months ago with romantic notions about cattle and clean living. His foreman had quit 3 weeks back, and the replacement hadn't started yet. That left Jack alone with 200 head of cattle and pride too thick to ask for help. Sarah pulled her truck up to the main house just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Jack emerged onto the porch, his expensive boots still too clean, his Stetson sitting at an angle that marked him as a weekend cowboy. But his eyes held worry. Even a greenhorn could read this sky. "Dr. Mitchell," he called out over the rising wind. "I wasn't expecting you today." "I know." Sarah climbed out of her truck, her worn jeans and faded jacket a stark contrast to his catalog fresh ranch wear. "But I heard the forecast. Jack, this isn't just rain coming. The weather service is calling for flash floods and hail. Your cattle are in the low pasture." His face went pale. The low pasture sat in a natural basin, perfect grazing land on a sunny day. In a storm like this, it would become a death trap. Water from the mountains would funnel straight down into that valley, and cattle were stubborn creatures. They wouldn't move until it was too late. "I can move them," Jack said, but uncertainty cracked through his voice. Sarah shook her head. "Not alone, you can't. Not in time. And not if you don't know the trails. There's only one route out of that pasture that won't take them through the creek bed, and in 30 minutes that creek is going to be a river." Thunder rolled across the mountains like God clearing his throat. The rain intensified, turning from drops to sheets in seconds. Jack looked at Sarah, then at the darkening pasture in the distance. She could see him doing the math. 200 cattle at current market prices. His entire investment. His dream. All of it standing in the path of a storm that didn't care about dreams. "Will you help me?" The question came out quieter than the rain drumming on the porch roof. Sarah was already walking back to her truck. "Get your horse saddled. I've got rope and flares in my truck. We've got maybe 20 minutes before that pasture floods." They worked in tandem, two strangers bound by urgency. Jack's hands shook as he saddled his horse, but he moved fast. Sarah grabbed her own gear from the truck, including the medical kit she never traveled without. She'd treated cattle in storms before, knew that panic and stampedes could injure animals as surely as rising water. The wind nearly tore the barn door from Jack's hands as they led the horses out. The storm had arrived in full force now, lightning cracking the sky open in jagged white lines. Sarah swung into her saddle with practiced ease, her horse dancing nervously beneath her. Jack mounted his gelding, and for just a moment their eyes met through the driving rain. "Stay close to me," Sarah shouted over the thunder. "Don't try to be a hero. We get them moving together or we don't get them moving at all." Then they were riding into the teeth of the storm, toward a pasture full of cattle that didn't yet know they were in danger. The rain stung like needles against Sarah's face, and somewhere in the mountains above, she could hear the first rumble of rushing water beginning its deadly descent. The horses fought them every step. Animals could sense disaster in ways humans had forgotten, and both mounts wanted to turn back toward the safety of the barn. Sarah kept her mare steady through sheer will and a lifetime of experience, while beside her Jack struggled to control his gelding. The path down to the low pasture had turned into a river of mud, the ground sucking at the horses' hooves with each step. "There." Jack pointed through the gray curtain of rain. Sarah could barely make out the dark shapes of the cattle clustered near the far end of the pasture. They'd grouped together like they always did in bad weather, seeking comfort in numbers. But that instinct would kill them today. When the water came, it would hit that corner first and hardest. Lightning split the sky close enough that Sarah felt the electricity raise the hair on her arms. In that brilliant flash, she saw what she'd feared. The creek at the north end of the pasture had already breached its banks. Brown water churned where grass had been that morning. They had minutes, not the 20 she'd hoped for. "We need to split up," Sarah yelled, though everything in her training said never separate in a crisis. "You take the east side, push them toward me. I'll get the leaders moving west. Once we get them started, they'll follow." Jack nodded, water streaming from the brim of his hat. For a greenhorn, he wasn't panicking. Sarah would remember that later, in quieter moments. She would remember that he trusted her completely, turned his horse without question, and rode toward danger because she told him to. Sarah spurred her mare forward, the animal reluctant but obedient. She'd brought this horse through difficult situations before. The mare understood that Sarah's judgment could be trusted even when every instinct screamed to run. They reached the first group of cattle, about 30 head that had separated slightly from the main herd. The rain was so heavy now that Sarah could barely see. She pulled out her first flare, struck it against her saddle, and held the brilliant red fire above her head. The cattle's eyes reflected the light, showing white with fear. She began to move them, using her horse to push against their flanks, shouting in a voice that cut through the storm. Cowboys had been moving cattle this way for 100 years. Some things didn't change. Across the pasture, she caught glimpses of Jack doing the same. His form was barely visible through the downpour, but she could see the glow of his flare, could hear his voice joining hers in the ancient language of the herder. The cattle began to move, slowly at first, then with growing momentum. But the storm had other plans. The sound came from upstream, a roar that started low and built to a freight train scream. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Flash flood. The mountains had released their burden all at once, and millions of gallons of water were racing down the canyon toward the pasture. She could see it now, a wall of brown fury studded with debris, tree branches, and rocks the size of cars. Jack. Her scream tore her throat raw. The high trail. Now. There was no time for careful herding anymore. Sarah fired her remaining flares into the air and began driving her horse directly into the herd, breaking every rule she knew. The cattle panicked and surged forward, which was exactly what she needed. Behind her, she heard Jack doing the same, his voice hoarse with fear and determination. The main body of the herd began to move as one, a river of muscle and hide flowing away from the approaching disaster. But some animals had broken off, confused by the noise and the lights. Sarah saw a pregnant heifer stumble, watched her go down in the mud. Without thinking, she turned her mare back. Sarah, no. Jack's voice cut through the storm. He'd seen her turn. She ignored him. That heifer represented new life, a calf that deserved a chance to breathe its first breath. Sarah reached the struggling animal and dismounted in one fluid motion. The water was already ankle-deep here, rising with terrifying speed. She grabbed the heifer's halter, pulling with strength born of pure desperation. The heifer found her feet and lurched forward just as the flood's leading edge hit. The impact knocked Sarah off her feet. Cold water engulfed her, filled her mouth and nose. She felt herself being swept away, felt the current grab her like a living thing determined to drag her down. Her fingers clawed for purchase on anything solid, finding only water and mud. Then strong hands locked around her wrist. Jack had ridden his horse directly into the flood, leaning down from the saddle with his arm extended. His face was a mask of concentration and terror. He pulled, his horse bracing against the current. Sarah felt herself rising from the water, felt Jack's other arm wrap around her waist and haul her across his saddle. They burst from the flood together, the horse scrambling up the slope toward the high trail. Behind them, the pasture disappeared beneath churning water. But ahead, through the rain, Sarah could see the dark mass of the herd reaching safety on higher ground. They'd done it. Against every odd, they'd saved the cattle. Jack didn't let go of her until they reached solid ground. When he finally did, his hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the reins. The old line shack sat on the ridge like a forgotten prayer, its weathered boards barely visible through the continuing storm. Sarah spotted it first, her clothes plastered to her skin, her body shaking with cold that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with shock setting in. Jack's horse was laboring beneath their combined weight, foam flecking its neck despite the rain washing everything clean. There, she managed through chattering teeth, pointing at the small structure. We need to get inside. The cattle had scattered across the high meadow, but they were safe now, well above the flood zone. They'd lost maybe a dozen head, animals that hadn't made it out in time or had panicked and run the wrong direction. It was a miracle they hadn't lost more. It was a miracle she and Jack were still breathing. Jack dismounted first, then helped Sarah down. Her legs nearly buckled when they hit solid ground. The adrenaline that had carried her through the rescue was draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Jack caught her elbow, steadying her, and together they stumbled toward the line shack with both horses trailing behind. The door hung crooked on its hinges, but it opened. Inside, the shack was a single room maybe 12 feet square, with a pot-bellied stove in one corner and a few pieces of ancient furniture covered in dust. It smelled like old wood and mouse droppings, but it was dry. That made it the most beautiful place Sarah had ever seen. Get the horses into that lean-to around back, Sarah said, forcing herself to think practically. They need to be out of the wind. While Jack tended to the animals, Sarah explored their shelter. There was wood stacked beside the stove, dry under a tarp that some long ago cowboy had left behind. Her hands shook as she built a fire, striking matches that kept going out until finally one caught. The kindling sparked and the flames grew, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jack came back inside just as real warmth began to spread from the stove. He was soaked through, his expensive ranch clothes ruined, his face pale beneath a layer of mud. But his eyes were alive in a way Sarah hadn't seen before. He'd just survived something real, something that money couldn't buy or protect him from. "You saved my life," he said quietly, shutting the door against the storm. "In that water, I thought." "You saved mine first," Sarah interrupted, stripping off her jacket and hanging it near the stove. "We're even." They stood on opposite sides of the small room, the fire crackling between them. Outside, thunder continued to roll across the mountains, but the worst of the storm was passing. The rain had settled into a steady drumbeat on the roof, almost peaceful compared to the violence of before. "I need to check you for injuries," Sarah said, slipping into her professional mode. "That water was moving fast. You could have broken ribs, internal bleeding." "I'm fine. But you're the one who went under." Sarah touched her side and winced. A bruise was already forming where something in the flood had struck her, but nothing felt broken. She'd been lucky. They'd both been incredibly lucky. Jack found a couple of old blankets in a chest, musty but serviceable. He handed one to Sarah without meeting her eyes, a gentleman even in crisis. They turned away from each other and stripped off their wet clothes, wringing them out and hanging them to dry. Sarah wrapped herself in the blanket, feeling suddenly vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with modesty. When they turned back around, Jack had stoked the fire higher. The warmth was starting to penetrate Sarah's chilled bones. They sat on opposite sides of the room, two strangers who'd just been through war together, and let the silence settle between them. "I was arrogant," Jack finally said. "Coming out here, thinking I could run a ranch because I'd watched some videos and read some books. My foreman tried to tell me I wasn't ready. He was right." Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Everyone starts somewhere. You rode into that flood without hesitating. That takes courage." "That was stupidity, not courage." "No." Sarah's voice was firm. "Courage is being afraid and doing it anyway. You were terrified. I saw it on your face. But you came after me." Jack looked at her across the firelight, really looked at her for perhaps the first time. Not as the veterinarian from town, not as hired help, but as the woman who'd risked her life for his cattle without being asked. The woman who'd known exactly what to do when he'd been paralyzed by indecision. "Why did you come out here today?" he asked. "You didn't have an appointment. You didn't owe me anything." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance. "My father had a ranch," she said finally. "Smaller than yours, but it was everything to him. When I was 16, a storm came through. Bigger than this one. He went out to save the herd alone because he was too proud to call for help. They found him 3 days later, downstream, tangled in a fence line." Jack's breath caught. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I became a vet because of him. Spent my whole life learning about cattle, about ranching, about all the things he tried to teach me. And I swore that if I ever saw another greenhorn rancher too stubborn to ask for help, too proud to admit he was in over his head, I wouldn't let him make my father's mistake." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the rain continued its endless rhythm. Jack moved across the room and sat beside Sarah, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough to be comfort without crossing any lines. "Thank you," he said simply. "For seeing what I couldn't. For not letting my pride kill me or my cattle." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They sat together through the long night, watching the fire burn down and building it back up, sharing stories about ranching and loss and dreams. Somewhere in those hours, something shifted between them. The stranger who'd bought the Double R ranch became someone else. Someone real. Someone who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and hadn't looked away. When dawn finally broke, pale and tentative through the storm-washed sky, they stepped outside together to survey the damage and begin the long work of recovery. But they stepped out different than they'd entered. Changed by flood and fire and the crucible of a night that had tested them both. The morning sun revealed a transformed landscape. Where Sarah's truck had been parked the day before, only mud remained. The low pasture had become a lake, brown water still swirling with debris. Fence lines were down for miles, twisted metal and splintered posts marking where the flood had passed through like an angry god. But the cattle were safe on high ground, grazing peacefully as if the night's terror had never happened. Jack stood beside Sarah on the ridge, surveying the destruction with eyes that held a new understanding. This was the reality of ranching that no book could teach. Nature gave with one hand and took with the other, and survival meant respecting that balance. "I need to call my insurance company," he said, his voice rough from shouting through the storm. "And find my phone. And figure out how to get down from this ridge without a vehicle." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Welcome to ranch life. Let's start by checking the herd. Some of them might have injuries from the panic. That pregnant heifer you helped me save needs examining." They spent the morning moving through the scattered cattle. Sarah's practiced eye-catching every limp, every shallow breath, every sign of distress. Jack followed her lead, learning through observation. She showed him how to approach a nervous cow, how to check for cuts and bruises, how to identify the animals that would need medical attention once they could get them back to the barn. The heifer Sarah had turned back for was fine, standing with her sisters and showing no signs of stress beyond what any animal would feel after such an ordeal. Jack watched Sarah examine her with hands that were gentle but confident, and something in his expression softened. "You really love this," he observed. "Not just the cattle. All of it." Sarah straightened, wiping her hands on her still damp jeans. "I do. The land, the animals, the work. People think ranching is romantic, but it's really just hard. Hard decisions, hard labor, hard losses. But when you save something, when you bring new life into the world or nurse a sick animal back to health, there's nothing else like it." By midday, they'd accounted for most of the herd. 13 animals were missing, either swept away by the flood or scattered too far to find immediately. It was a heavy loss, but it could have been catastrophic. It should have been catastrophic. Only Sarah's intuition and quick action had prevented total disaster. A helicopter appeared over the ridge around 2 in the afternoon, the sheriff's department doing welfare checks on the isolated ranches. They landed in the high meadow, the pilot's face showing relief when he saw Jack and Sarah alive and standing. He brought news from below. 3 bridges were out. 2 other ranches had lost their entire herds. A teenage boy from the Johnson place was missing, swept away trying to save his horse. Jack's face went gray at that news. It could so easily have been him or Sarah. The margin between survival and tragedy had been measured in seconds, in the strength of a hand gripping a wrist, in a horse's courage to stand against a current. The helicopter took Sarah back to town first. She had other clients, other animals that needed her care. She'd been gone from her practice for nearly 24 hours, and her assistant would be frantic. But before she climbed into the helicopter, she turned back to Jack. "You did good," she told him over the rotor noise. "Better than good. You listened, you learned, and you didn't quit. That's what matters out here." Jack grabbed her hand, his grip tight. "Come back. When things settle down, come back to the ranch. I need to hire a proper foreman, someone who knows this land. Someone who won't let me make stupid mistakes. Someone who—" "I'm a veterinarian," Sarah interrupted gently. "Not a foreman." "Then be my vet. Exclusive contract. Whatever you want. Just don't walk away and leave me stumbling around in the dark." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, seeing past the expensive boots and the Denver polish to the man underneath. The one who'd ridden into a flood without hesitation. The one who'd sat with her through the long night and listened to stories about her father without offering empty platitudes. The one who was genuinely trying to learn from his mistakes instead of making excuses for them. "I'll come back," she promised. "Once you get power and roads restored, call me. We'll talk about your herd management and medical protocols." The helicopter lifted off, and Sarah watched the double-R ranch shrink below her. Jack stood in the meadow waving until distance made him invisible. She settled back in her seat, exhausted beyond measure but feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose, maybe. Or connection. Or the simple satisfaction of knowing she'd made a difference. In town, the damage was less severe but still significant. Sarah's clinic had lost power, and her assistant met her at the door with a list of emergency calls. A dog with a broken leg. A horse with colic. A cat stuck in a tree that had fallen across someone's roof. Sarah pushed her own exhaustion aside and went to work. This was what she did. This was who she was. But through it all, she found her thoughts drifting back to the ranch on the ridge, to the man who'd trusted her with his dream and his life. She wondered if he was managing alone, if he'd found food and dry clothes, if he was looking at the destruction and regretting his decision to play cowboy. She wondered, and the wondering surprised her with its intensity. 3 days passed before her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Jack's voice came through tired but determined. The roads are passable. Power's back on. And I've got a cow with what looks like an infected cut. Can you come out? Sarah was already reaching for her keys. I'll be there in an hour. When she arrived at the Double R, the cleanup had begun. Work crews were rebuilding fences. A new foreman, recommended by the local Cattlemen's Association, was directing operations with quiet competence. And Jack was in the barn with the injured cow, talking to her softly while he waited for Sarah to arrive. Their eyes met across the barn, and Sarah felt it again. That connection, that recognition of shared experience that bound people together more surely than any contract or agreement. They'd been through fire together, or rather flood. They'd saved lives together. That created a bond that wouldn't easily break. Show me the patient, Sarah said, setting down her medical kit. But they both knew she'd come back for more than just a cow with an infected cut. She'd come back because something had started on that ridge in the storm, and neither of them was quite ready to let it go. 6 months after the storm, the Double R Ranch had transformed. New fences marked clean lines across the pastures. The low basin had been redesigned with drainage systems that would prevent another deadly flooding. The herd had grown back to full strength, supplemented by careful purchases and the arrival of spring calves. And Jack Reynolds had transformed too. Sarah watched him work from her truck, parked near the main barn where she just finished vaccinating the last of the new calves. He moved through the cattle with confidence now, his expensive boots replaced by worn leather that bore the scars of real work. His hands had calluses. His face had weathered from hours in the sun. The greenhorn was gone, replaced by a rancher who'd earned his place through sweat and determination. But it was more than physical changes. Jack had spent the months after the storm learning with a hunger that impressed even the old-timers in the valley. He'd hired good people and, more importantly, he'd listened to them. The foreman he'd brought in, a weathered cowboy named Dutch who'd worked cattle for 40 years, had become his mentor. And Sarah had become something else entirely. She came to the ranch 3 times a week now, far more than any veterinary contract required. Sometimes she came for legitimate medical calls. Other times she came because Jack had a question about herd rotation or because one of the hands needed her to look at a horse with a suspicious limp. And sometimes she came because they'd fallen into a pattern of having dinner together, sitting on the porch of the main house and watching the sun set over the mountains while they talked about everything and nothing. "You're staring," Jack called out, walking toward her truck with that easy stride he'd developed. "Either you're worried about one of my cows, or you've got something on your mind." Sarah climbed out of the truck, medical kit in hand. "The calves all look good. Strong and healthy. You should be proud." "We should be proud," Jack corrected, reaching her side. "None of this happens without you." It was true, though Sarah would never say it. She'd guided every decision Jack made about the herd over the past 6 months. Which bulls to buy for breeding. Which cows to cull. How to manage the grazing rotation to maximize the health of both cattle and land. She'd been teacher, advisor, and partner in ways that went far beyond a simple veterinary contract. They walked together toward the house, falling into the comfortable silence that had become their language. Inside, Jack had coffee brewing, and something that smelled suspiciously like homemade stew simmering on the stove. He'd learned to cook over the winter, another skill the old Jack would never have bothered with. "I got an offer yesterday," Jack said as he poured coffee into 2 mugs. "Corporate headhunter called. They want me back in Denver. Chief technology officer for a startup. Triple what I'm making here. Hell, triple what I'm losing here, if we're being honest about the ranch's finances." Sarah's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. This was the moment she'd known would come eventually. Jack had money, connections, a whole life waiting for him beyond these mountains. The ranch had been a dream, maybe even a fantasy. But dreams were expensive, and reality had sharp teeth. "What did you tell them?" She kept her voice carefully neutral. Jack looked at her over his coffee mug, his eyes serious. "I told them no." "Jack. Let me finish." He set down his mug and moved closer. 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately. I was playing cowboy, Sarah. You knew it, Dutch knew it, everyone in the valley knew it. This ranch was my midlife crisis, my attempt to buy meaning instead of earning it. But that storm changed things. Sarah waited, barely breathing. "You changed things," Jack continued. "You showed me what real commitment looks like. What real courage is. You risked your life for my cattle, animals you had no stake in, because that's who you are. You don't do things halfway. You don't quit when it gets hard. And you don't pretend to be something you're not." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah had come to recognize as a sign he was working through something difficult. I'm not pretending anymore. This ranch isn't a game or a hobby. It's my life now. The cattle, the land, the work, it matters. Not because it makes me money or because it looks good. It matters because I'm building something real. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. You've come a long way from the man who didn't know enough to move his cattle out of the low pasture. I had a good teacher. Jack smiled, but there was vulnerability in his expression. Actually, I had the best teacher. Someone who never made me feel stupid for not knowing, who answered every dumb question, who showed up in the middle of a storm because she knew I needed help even when I was too proud to ask for it. That's what neighbors do out here. Is that all we are? Jack asked quietly. Neighbors? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 6 months of shared meals, lingering looks, and conversations that stretched late into the night. Sarah had felt it growing, this thing between them that was more than professional courtesy and deeper than friendship. She tried to ignore it, tried to maintain boundaries. But boundaries were hard to maintain with someone who'd pulled you from a flood and sat with you through the long night while you talked about your dead father. I don't know what we are, Sarah admitted. But I know I look forward to coming here. I know I think about you when I'm not here. I know that when you called about that infected cut, I was relieved because it meant I had a reason to see you. Jack closed the distance between them in 2 steps. He didn't touch her, didn't push, just stood close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth of him. I kept my cattle alive because you were brave enough to ride into a storm and teach a stubborn fool how to listen. But you kept something else alive too. You reminded me that life is bigger than stock portfolios and board meetings. That real value comes from building something with your own hands, from taking care of things that depend on you, from being part of something larger than yourself. He paused, and Sarah saw something flicker across his face. Not uncertainty, but hope. Fragile and bright. Stay, he said simply. Not as a contractor or a neighbor or a teacher. Stay as my partner. Help me build this ranch into something that matters. Help me become the rancher I'm trying to be. Help me, his voice caught. Help me figure out what this thing is between us, because I think it might be the most important thing I've ever found. Sarah looked at the man before her. Not the wealthy executive who'd bought a ranch on a whim, but the rancher who'd ridden into a flood without hesitation. The man who'd listened to her stories and learned from his mistakes. The man who'd chosen a hard life over an easy one because he'd discovered something worth fighting for. I'll stay, she said, and watched joy transform his face. On one condition. Anything. Next time a storm comes, we move the cattle together. No heroes, no solo missions. We're partners now, which means we protect each other. Jack pulled her into his arms, and Sarah let herself lean into the embrace. Outside, the double-R ranch spread across the valley in the golden afternoon light. Cattle grazed peacefully. Fences stood strong. And 2 people who'd been strangers 6 months ago stood together in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and stew, building something new from the ashes of a storm that had tested them both. The ranch would have hard times again. Nature guaranteed that. But it would face those times with 2 people who'd learned how to weather storms together, who'd learned that the strongest structures weren't built in calm weather but forged in the fire of shared struggle. Jack never forgot what Sarah had done for him. But more than that, he never forgot what she'd shown him about himself. That he was capable of more than he'd imagined. That real wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts but in the strength to face a flood without flinching. That the best things in life couldn't be bought, only earned through sweat and courage and the willingness to trust someone when they told you the storm was coming. And Sarah had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. A partner who valued her knowledge and respected her strength. A man who looked at her and saw not just a veterinarian from town, but the woman who'd saved his cattle and taught him what it meant to really live. A place where her father's legacy could continue in work that mattered and lessons that would be passed down to the next person who needed to learn them. The storm had passed, but what it left behind was worth every moment of terror. Worth every risk. Worth every mile ridden through rain and flood. Because some things could only be built when the world tried to tear you apart, and you chose to stand together instead of falling alone. They kept the cattle alive. And in doing so, they found something neither had expected. They found home.